Welcome back to another episode of the Contagious Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle King, and the goal of this podcast is to help you create environments and ecosystems where people thrive. Look, we are bringing someone back to another episode, Dr. Daniel Freeman. And last time we talked, it was all about fundraising. It was all about insights on fundraising leadership. And today we're going to be featuring and talking about something new, an idea called Views from the Back Row. And I want to be able to just invite him up and share his philosophies, his methodologies, and his stories on leadership and how it will help you as the leader understand, unpack, but potentially redesign how you approach leadership. Dr. Dan, how you doing, brother?
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me today on this
Oh,
slightly rainy Friday. Cloudy Friday.
oh no, I love it, man. As I am, we have conversations all the time.
Mhm.
And I'm so excited to have this conversation because you're working on something new, a book called View from the Back Row. And before we go into all of the deep questions that I want to be able to ask so that I could be able to extract how you view leadership, why this
Mhm.
title? And what does the back row perspective give us that corner office might miss?
Yeah, when I was trying to think of a title for this book, I remember over the past few years as I moved into kind of leadership roles in, I guess, what people would call indirect leadership roles. Like indirect would be leading opportunities, leading sessions, leading events, certain things, but maybe not being the leader. And my mentors would always say to me, hey, you need to learn how to lead from where you are. And you read that in books all the time, right? And I always feel like in those books and those conversations, no one ever gives it straight. No one ever says, this is exactly how you do it. This is exactly how you lead from the position you're in. And I started to think to myself, and really this year, I feel like it's clicked for me. Similar to my vision on servant leadership and what that means, which we talked about in the last podcast, understanding what it means to lead from the back, right? And that kind of does tie into servant leadership a little bit. But to go back to it, that title, leading from the back, I think was really important because that's where it begins, right? You have to understand how to lead yourself. And if you can lead yourself from the back, you kind of think of it like you're in the back, you're leading, you're learning how to lead yourself, and then you start to move forward a little bit. You meet people along the way that you're working with that are around you, and you're helping them as a thought partner. People start to see you as a leader, and then you move up to the next group of people that they introduce you to, right? Or that you meet in your organization. And then those people start to see you as a leader by your actions and the things that you're doing. And then you move your way up, 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 up. And everyone talks about how to lead. Not necessarily, they don't say from the front, but I'm thinking, I want a book that's going to teach people how do you lead from where you are if it's not in the front? If you've come into a position where you thought you were going to be the leader and you're not the leader,
Hmm.
or you came in and you want to move to the front. How do you learn how to do that for yourself? And then how do you build that around yourself and change that mindset, right? And reframe the situations to say, how can I lead in this? What have I learned to be a leader from this situation? So, long story long, that's kind of why I liked that title.
And we've talked about this extensively, but I want to go back for a second. Um, let's go back to the second week in your first leadership role. You
Mhm.
walk into the meeting you're supposed to lead, and suddenly you realize, wait, I'm in charge here. What was going through your head, and what did you get wrong that day that you do differently now?
I think certainly I can answer that. The first thing for me is I kind of look at the scenarios that I've been in and I reflect back on my situation. And I've said this to a few people.
Yeah.
People always say, I want to lead a listening tour, right? And I kind of think that's a cliche phrase, right? Because if if that's your focus, but you're not actually an active listener, or you're not maybe taking notes or not doing certain things that really benefit that and benefit the people you're listening to, then what are you really doing, right? It kind of feels performative to a degree. Not that everyone who says they're doing that is being performative, but when I came into the role, um, first leadership role, there were a lot of expectations. We need to do X, Y, Z. We need to do it now. And I was like, okay, this is coming from, this is the directive I've got, so I'm going to do it. And I reflect back on that and I'm like, that was a failure. And I just call it what it is, because I'm not afraid of failing. I've done that a lot in my life, career, had a lot of missteps, but that's helped me who I am, and it's helped shape my outlook. So what I did is I went in and I just jumped in, right? I didn't have the time to actually go and meet the people that I wanted to and try to build relationships with them and learn what kind of value I can bring to them, which is just, that's my authentic self. That's what I try to do. So that was the piece for me, is that was that first issue, is that I was doing what was asked of me, but I didn't follow my authentic self of what I wanted to do and what I needed to do. And that, that can certainly put a bad taste in people's mouths. They don't know that that's what I've been told to do, right?
Mm.
They just know that this person's coming to me and asking me for things when they don't even know me, right? And to me, and I think that's that's something I certainly would have changed going into my, first higher level leadership kind of role, is really taking that time to get to know people, what they're working on, at least the first few weeks or the first month, or kind of like when I was at Drexel in my role, the first 2 months, our executive assistant was setting me up on tons of Zoom meetings, because it was 2020 at the time. She set up a ton of meetings for me to meet all of these people. And I think that's probably the second best thing, right? Is if you don't necessarily have time to get in front of all these people, at least set up meetings, right? In person or online, to take that time and just fill up that first month with those meetings. Because, whether you're meeting people internally or externally, I think that's a really great way to get a good lay of the land.
Why do you think that's important, though?
I think it goes to the servant leadership side, right? There needs to be vulnerability and trust as a leader. Leaders need to be vulnerable to show people that it's okay to fail, it's okay to change, it's okay to acknowledge that maybe what you've done isn't correct or that it could be adjusted. And I think that inherently comes with trust, because people start to trust the fact that this leader realizes that they're not all powerful, that they don't know everything. And the hope is obviously that if they make that vulnerable decision, or they make that conversation, it's not going to be every time they do something wrong, they apologize and they never fix it. Right. But I think that it's so important, because you need to come in, you need to listen, you need to figure out what's going on. Doesn't mean that you're not going to change it, or you're not going to have suggestions about what's going on. But just like we've talked about with donors, right? People need to feel seen, they need to feel heard, and they need to feel appreciated. And when you can do those things accurately and let people know that, like, you're here for a bigger picture, right? For the vision to help that succeed, which includes helping them succeed and making them feel empowered and that they can trust you. Like, that's why it's so important. And just like in our work as fundraisers, a lot of that always starts with the first conversation.
I hear a lot, especially here more lately, that self-awareness, vulnerability is so important for a leader. First, to be able to embody within themselves, but then also to be able to impart on their teams as well. What is your belief on the importance of self-awareness in leadership, and how that could be the foundational piece for great leadership?
I think that if you're not aware of yourself internally, just like if you don't know what your intrinsic motivations are, you certainly can't be looking on the outside. You can't assess what's going on externally if you can't even assess yourself, right? You're the closest person to you. So if you can't understand where you're going, what you're doing, and what you need to say, how can you assess what other people are? So for me, I think that awareness, and that's something I've always tried to bring in whatever role that I've been in. And it could be something as simple as yesterday, I saw my colleague, like Monday, we had a charity golf classic that I was out to with some people. Tuesday, had a ton of visits. Wednesday, had more visits, but I stopped back at the office and I saw one of my colleagues and I was like, "You got a haircut?" And she's like, "You are the first person to notice." And she's like, "And I knew you would." And I said, "Yeah, because it's important to me." Right? Like if I'm paying $50 to get my hair done and get my hair cut, right? I kind of want someone to notice it, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
doing it for a reason or another, because that tells me someone's really seeing me.
Mm,
And they're seeing my presence, right? Because we know that that's something just like, getting a new piece of clothing, this or that. Like sometimes it, increases the swag, right? It makes you feel good. You get a little sparkle in your eye or a little, pop in your step. And to me, that's one of those big things. Like when I saw her yesterday and I was like, okay, I would want someone to notice it. So I want to notice it on her because it shows that I don't just look at her as a worker bee, right? Or this or
mm,
that. Like I see her as a person. I see
yeah.
what she's doing outside of work as well, right? And we can have those conversations. So to me, I think it kind of goes back to what I said before. That awareness is so important, but you have to
Exactly.
be aware of yourself and your decisions and the impacts that they make before you can be more aware of everything going on around you. Because what you do impacts people, and what goes on around you and your team impacts them as well. So that goes back to that leadership piece too, where I talk about being a servant leader. You need to remove any barriers that affect the success that your employees can have or could have or are having. But you also need to be a buffer for things that are coming down the pipeline that could affect what they're doing. And that all comes to awareness, and that comes back to servant leadership and how I view it.
What's one thing you wish someone told you before your first leadership moment?
I think, and it's something I've worked on, and I found myself, I think like early on, right? There were some times really early in my career that I was able to be in leadership meetings and I wasn't in a leadership role. But from there to fast forward to now, I think it's discernment.
Hmm.
Um, one of the things I've worked on this year is discernment, right? Figuring out when you're in a meeting as a leader, whether you're with leaders that are above you on the same level, whatever that may be, it's discerning what's going on in the right kind of awareness too, right? Discerning what's going on in the conversation, what are they talking about? Can you respond? Should you respond? And even deeper, if you respond, are you responding with value adds to the conversation? Because if not, there's no reason to interject yourself in that conversation. Because we all know that there's a lot of power in silence and a lot of power in listening versus thinking and formulating what you need to say while people are talking. You're not absorbing it properly. But I think that discernment is really big. And that's something I've worked on over the last like year and a half or so. But earlier in my career, I wish someone would have said that to me. And it's not that I talked a lot, but I was actually the opposite. I was afraid to talk earlier in my career. And I had all these things that I wanted to say, but I like kept my mouth shut because I didn't understand that. I didn't understand like, okay, you don't have to say everything, but you need to figure out what should you say because it can add to this conversation. And I think for young professionals, that's a huge thing. And then when you're a leader, it's even more important because, hey, there is nothing worse than being in a meeting and people go on these tangents and start having conversations about things that don't benefit the conversation and should be a side conversation. I mean, hey, I did it at our in-person HOA meeting that we have yearly at the end of October. And I had two neighbors who'd been there since the development was built come up and say, this was the fastest HOA meeting we have ever had, and it's the best one that we had. And it's because I laid down the ground rules. And I was like, hey, if you need to say something, we're going to call on you, but this is what it's going to look like. And this is how we're going to move forward. And if you want to have an external conversation about something that may relate to what we're talking about, but it's not exactly, let's talk after, right? Post meeting.
That's good. You've raised millions of dollars across major universities, but I'm curious about, I guess, that first time that you had to lead people, not just lead projects, because there's a difference. When did you realize that managing a campaign was different than managing people?
Yeah, so I think that I'll give you the people part of it first.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the people part of it first was there was a little bit at UNC Charlotte, again, the indirect, right? Because we're doing events, we're working with people for hospitality areas, we're directing them and leading them on what we need, what should be done. I would say Asheville was probably the first time where I had the indirect, like real leadership, where I was working directly with coaches. I had a number of coaches that I was working with on fundraising,
Yeah.
whether it was putting together alumni events or having conversations with them about alums who were donors and kind of working with them on how to strategize, how to reach out to those people, how to build out these plans, like what that strategy is going to look like and how to lead them in that fundraising part of it. So that was probably the first piece for me, and that came naturally because I'm always curious, and I love learning, right? So I have a lot of knowledge, and for me, I was always great at asking questions, but at that time, I probably would ask too many questions versus discerning, like, okay, what's going to be a helpful question to ask them? And that was the time I think I shared with you, like when I was learning what it really meant to serve individuals and donors and the people around you and add value. So later in my career, I realized how to keep things a little more simple. But at that point, it was asking a lot of questions, working with them. I probably should have taken a little bit more leadership to help direct them, since this was what I was doing. But I think looking at that at the same time at Asheville, I was in meetings for, I feel like it was a number of months. I feel like it was more than like 6 months as we prepared for a $10 million plus comprehensive campaign. And we were on the athletic side, but I was, the liaison on the university side. So I'd go meet with annual giving. I did presentations on our database with Razor's Edge when we transitioned over. I was doing a lot of those things, but being in that kind of campaign and being connected in it, which was really nice, getting to see how they started the vision, what it was going to support, what the top 100 list looked like, and being in that room of maybe 30 people and kind of understanding the difference between leading a coach versus what it looks like to be part of a campaign and watching those leaders kind of working through what that looks like and that strategy. Those were probably those first 2 points, because the campaign, I mean, you can look at it as one smaller, one bigger, right? You could call me working with these coaches, fundraising for their teams. Those are small campaigns, right? Small crowdfunding campaigns. And then, we're looking at this $10 million plus campaign at that time, which it's ended up being more than that since I left. But looking at that, it's just so different in terms of, you're obviously looking at things on a larger level, but there's so much more strategy in terms of relationships. And again, I've learned that since then. I left UNC Asheville in 2020, and I'm still close with a lot of people I worked with there and still talk to people who are there. But looking at that, to me, that's one of the biggest things. And that's something I've enjoyed the most. I did that yesterday with work. Me and a foundation board member went to lunch with a potential prospect that we'd love to bring into the fold and work with us because of what their values are. So it's really the relationships and the strategy behind introductions and how to move a conversation. Me and the foundation board member had that conversation before and afterwards. Like, how do we want to move the conversation? What does it look like? She displayed discernment from when we were talking after that conversation too. And it's just on such a higher level because the stakes are higher.
That's good.
Right? That's it. Stakes are higher. So you have to figure out how to mature that on the next level.
Here's something that I see very, very often, and I'm glad that you mentioned the strategy of relationships. I see leaders hoard information. I see them hoarding opportunities for whatever reason, but most times I believe it's just because that they're scared. What I've seen in my own experience is that they call it being strategic, but really it's kind of, self-preservation. You have a whole chapter on this in the book, and I believe it's phenomenal. What's the difference between protecting yourself and empowering your team?
Preach. That self-preservation is one of the worst things that you can do in our work. And I think the first thing that comes to mind, right, when you think of self-preservation is just lack of communication. But it's intentional, right? Because if you're self-preserving, which morphs into withholding information that could benefit your organization and other individuals that are working with you, reporting to you, could help improve said relationship or move it forward, withholding that information just makes the organization look bad. And if you're leading the organization, that makes you look bad. I mean, recently I was looking at, there was a situation I was looking at, and I saw that someone had said, like, oh, they were meeting with someone. I'm sorry, they didn't say that. I just happened to find out that they were meeting with someone, and it's happened more than once. And, I look at that situation and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get mad, right? There's no reason to cry over spilled milk. But I look at it and I think to myself, there's a deeper problem there with self-preservation. And I think when leaders are self-preserving, it's really connected to insecurity, right? And I think that's also a compliment, right? And that's me reframing it. Sounds crazy, right? But if someone's self-preserving and it intentionally affects you, I always look at it and say, well, that's a compliment because they're scared of you. They're scared that you're good, that you are going to be so successful and you're doing things so well that if you're given this privy information, you're going to look better than them. Exactly. You're going to lift up. And you and I both know the same thing, right? Like, our jobs as thought partners, leaders, indirectly, directly, is to lift others up, right? Like the cliche thing of like rising tide, like that's true. But, I look at in my work, I always want to promote accessibility, opportunity. I want to lift others up. And because that makes me feel good. And that may be my athlete mentality, because I always got more excitement out of cheering on my teammates and my friends that had success than I ever did for myself. So when you look at this self-preservation, I think it's a reflection on the organization or the team overall. I think it's a compliment for the individual that feels like information is being withheld from them, because it means that there's this scarcity mindset that if you succeed, it's going to make someone else look bad. But I think that also trains us to have the mindset of, we're not going to do that, right? My belief for years has always been, you should never be the smartest person in the room, and you should want people to do better. And I've had this conversation with a few presidents recently within the last few months, that if you are training great people and you're coaching and you're building great teams, if someone ends up leaving, right, and you don't want them to leave, that stinks. But you know what? If you did everything you could for that person succeeded where you were, and then they went to a higher position, what are they going to tell people if they had a great experience? They're going to say, you need to go work for Dan. I had such a good experience. He helped me, even though he didn't want me to leave, and it probably hurt his team. He still empowered me. He was a reference for me. He did X, Y, Z. You created another advocate. And that's philanthropy, right? It's creating referrals, creating advocates, people that speak highly of your individual work, your teamwork. To me, that is just so incredibly important for the work that we do is we have to lift others up. We have to create, people talk about a culture of philanthropy, right? At institutions, at nonprofits, whatever. There needs to be a culture of empowerment, a culture of, quote, philanthropy on your team, right? Because if you're empowering people, you're sending them up to the big leagues, and then they're telling people about what you've done. That's how you create that internal culture that everyone seems to want for philanthropy as well, which then ties into what we've talked about, which is, my belief in leadership is you treat your donors and their time, talent, and treasure, you treat your employees the same exact way.
What does this look like in practice? Like one thing that I heard recently was like, what is your Monday morning example?
That's a good question. I think the first piece is advocating. For me, I think that what does this look like in practice? When it's advocating for people. And one of the things that I love to do, back to what I just said, is if I'm in a meeting and I've worked with our marketing person or I've worked with my direct colleague, either of them right now, if they do something good, I'm going to say, and I've done it in a bunch of cabinet meetings, after working with so-and-so, this is what we did, they did a great job setting me up for XYZ, or, me and Y had worked together on creating this, and we decided that this really streamlined our unit plans and what we had done. And that's if it comes to me, right? Because we're talking about discernment too. But I think the first piece is acknowledgement. I think the second piece is advocating, right? If we want to create this culture of lifting everyone up, you've got to advocate. I remember in a previous role, I had worked with a colleague and I was more senior to them, but I was having conversations with leadership and I was able to tell them, hey, I worked with X and they did this. They just closed these 2 gifts, which is awesome. They may not even know I'm saying that, but to me, that's the point of advocacy, is if you have the space and you have the time and you get the face time and you're being heard, use that in a positive manner, right? You're going to talk about yourself and what you're doing because you need to give updates, but also I think it's even more important to advocate for others and lift them up, whether you're indirect leader, direct leader, a colleague. That's how you start to build that. And I think the third piece to that is, you have the acknowledgement, you have the advocacy. And then I think the third piece is growth, right? And I don't say it in the side of you can help them grow, but I'm saying finding opportunities for you to grow together, finding opportunities to be thought partners together, to allow them to share feedback with you, because that's going to help them sharpen that iron, right? Especially if they want a leader and they want to move up, they need to learn how to provide good feedback, how to provide good insight or be a good thought partner. And you receiving that really shows vulnerable leadership. And I think that's really important. And then you can give them the feedback that sharpens that iron of how they're giving the feedback, right? So it's a give and take. So I think those 3 are kind of the things that come into my head first of kind of how to represent that.
One of the challenges that I've often seen, Dan, is when we begin to lead in those ways, when we begin to lead intentionally, when you become really good at what you do, it makes people nervous. It makes potentially other leaders feel what I would say threatened by you. Tell us about a time where you walked into a room and you could feel that tension. Someone saw you potentially as competition rather than collaboration.
Yeah, there was definitely a few jobs ago. I remember that where I had success, wasn't talking about it, didn't push it right. Like success in silence, people always kind of talk like working in silence. That was a time where I was really confident after my first year. I was really confident that what I was doing was the right thing. And I saw it coming, right? I didn't need anyone else to tell me that after that first year. So I worked in silence. I let my metrics that everyone could see, I let my metrics speak for themselves. No one mentioned me in uh, advancement meetings, like the gifts that I had closed, even though other people were mentioned for smaller gifts. Like that didn't matter to me because I was competing with myself. And I just remember I had a colleague who had been there, how many, 3 or 4 years before me, and had been promoted a couple times. And they had not hit their metrics. They hadn't hit the most important metrics in the work that they had done. And I remember the tension, right? That I'd hear occasionally. They said something to someone else about me, or they were promoting themselves when they weren't doing anything, incredible. But then there were other people higher up that were promoting them too. And I was just like, whatever, if you feel threatened by me, then I'm doing something right. And I think for me, it came to a head when I remember I was given an opportunity that no one else had been given previously in any role of mine, or one above it or any below it. And it was because of the identification, qualification, cultivation work that I had done. And this school needed that help for me to do it. And I remember hearing from someone, a higher up, that they knew that I would do a great job with it. And even in the short period of time that I did, but that there were people mad who voiced their opinion to leadership, that they didn't think I deserved it because I hadn't been here long enough, even though I had far surpassed just the objective metrics of that person and a lot of other people. And that was probably one of it didn't stick for me in terms of like, there are always ebbs and flows about how you feel about yourself and your work. But at that time, it was kind of just like, if people aren't judging you, right, then you're not doing it right. And it's kind of like, can't remember if I shared this quote recently, but it's one of my favorites. If people are talking about you in a negative sense, they're never working as hard as you, because the people working as hard as you are working harder than you. They don't have time to talk like that, but also they want to pull you up with them normally. Because
That's
those
so
high performers
interesting.
are like, come with me.
It's interesting that you share that, because I really don't be talking about people. And I really don't have the time nor the capacity to focus on that. I'm always thinking about, in what I'm currently doing, like executing, how can I be moving people forward?
Yeah.
With what you just said, though, is powerful, because you recognize that, you realize, and you just kept going. But for that person that's experiencing that now, what do you do in that moment? Like, do you make yourself smaller? Do you confront it? Do you just keep doing what you're doing? Like, what is the move? What is that step-by-step framework that you would recommend for that person?
Yeah. I think the thing I've been thinking about recently in those scenarios is, you cannot let someone else dim your light. I have felt that before, and you can't do it, right? Because if they're dimming your light, it's a reason. They want to dim your light so that it's the same brightness as theirs. And if you're inherently and already brighter than that, why would you do that? Why would you stoop down to that? You have an intrinsic motivation, and there's a reason that your light is bright, and there's a reason that theirs is dim. And if that's how they want it to be, great, but you don't have to go down to that level. I think that's the first thing, is recognizing that, acknowledging it, and just kind of taking a second to say, okay, I can't let them dim my light. I deserve better than that. And I think the second thing is, and this is kind of like another funny quib that I'd heard recently, was like, I'm only going to fight for the people that I care for in terms of correcting them and having constructive conversations. If I'm silent with you, it's because I'm not going to waste my time
Mm,
and I'm not going to waste my energy because I know it's not worth it. But if I care about you, I'm going to put myself out there to have that constructive conversation about how that made me feel or the way that you're acting, because you are worth my energy.
that's good.
So I think that's the second piece. And then I think the third piece is recognizing where you are. I had a conversation with a leader recently, and he had said to me, it could be a blessing or a curse. He said, but the moment I start to realize that I'm not going to work well with someone, or I'm, or this isn't going to be a good situation. And for him, it was someone that he reported to. He had said, for better or for worse, I start planning my exit. He was like, blessing. He said, blessing or curse. He said, I can't spend my energy on that. He said, why would I want to be there? Our job in nonprofit work, we're serving everyone else, right? If you're doing the job right, you're using a lot of energy. You're serving so many other people, so many visions, so many departments, whatever it may be. And this may be the millennial thinking, right? People talk about millennial bosses and what they're like and such. But I have this millennial thought that's like, you have to ask yourself, is this situation serving me anymore?
That's good.
Because you can't be given 100% and then your situation's giving you nothing.
Mm,
Right? If you're feeling more stress than you are reward, if you're feeling more stress than you are impact, if you continue to hit roadblocks, which is impacting the work that you know is going to make a difference,
that's good.
is it really serving you? Because then if you become resentful, if you start really having an issue internally, like with yourself, not internally department, internally with yourself, that's going to affect the outcomes that you're trying to create, the people you're working with, and the impact you want to make. And I know there are a lot of people that have the mindset of, keep shifting, keep adapting, keep adjusting. And I think that's correct in some situations. But I also think in the world that we live in right now, especially so many changes going from, full remote work to hybrid to some people being remote work to now so many places saying, okay, you got to come back to the office 5 days a week. Right.
Mhm.
That's a huge change for places. That's a huge change for people. And it all comes back to what are your values? Why are you in this role? Why do you want to make an impact
Yeah.
in this world that you're working in? And does your current situation fit that? Can you be successful in that? Do you have the tools? Do you have the support? Do you have the belief? And do you have the team to do that? And that also connects, as you can tell, I love to connect everything when I'm
Yeah.
talking because I did Legos for, so much. Um, Careers are not linear anymore. They're not.
Yeah.
Careers aren't linear, and people need to understand that. And I think accepting that and, you know, as a kind of thought partner, confidant had once told me, radical acceptance is not easy, but like if you can just accept what's going on, even if it's crappy, even if it's not great, once you can accept, then you can move forward to the next step and say, okay, can I make this better? How do I need to adjust? What does a good situation look like for me?
You have this concept, rock stars versus superstars. I've talked about it in another podcast a few times, and it's definitely something. If I write another book, I need to put it in there. Can you unpack that for us, though? Like, what's the difference between a rock star versus a superstar, and why does it matter in creating a thriving culture?
Yeah. So when I think of myself as a leader, right, we know that people, when you come into a leadership role, if there are people in there, you have to understand that maybe not everyone is suited for the role that they're in. And that means you really need to assess each person as an individual and the expectations of that role. And you need to make sure that people are playing on their strengths, but also growing and learning in the areas that are weak for them. But you need to set them up for success to do those things. And you could kind of equate that to how I work portfolios and fundraising, which is I have my primary portfolio, which is people who are ready to give in the next 6 to 12 months. Then I have a secondary portfolio, which is people who are ready to give in the next 16, 18, 24 months. And what that means is those people who I think are ready to give in the first, 6 to 12 months, those people are ready to go. They're most normally set up in the right position for success. I either have a proposal ready, we've had conversations, we're not exactly there yet. Maybe I need to gain more trust, but I've put them in the right place for success. And I would say that employees and reports, some of them are in that position. But then you have the people in that 16, 18 to 24 month area who aren't ready yet, those donors. And I would equate those donors to people who maybe are in a role where some of their strengths are at play, but the role focuses more in areas that they're weak. And if we need them to perform now, we need to figure out how do we keep the balance of the team, but how do we shift them into something that will help them execute more while they can still work on those weaknesses, but maybe we need to redirect their current action. So I can connect that to rockstar and superstar as your rock stars are your people who are there. Not everyone wants to be promoted. Some people want to stay in the role that they're in, make more money, keep doing what they're doing, and they just kill it. They do a great job. They get the work done. They're on time. They continually overperform, but they don't want to be a leader. They want to work on a team. They want to go on vacation 2 months a year. Or 2 weeks a year, or multiple 2-week vacations. They don't want to report to a president. They don't want people reporting to them. They want to do what they're doing. So that's a rock star. Those are the people you need to take care of where they are because they're happy, and you need to continue to keep them happy. Then you have your rock stars. Your rock stars are your high performers, your type A, your people who continue to exceed expectations, and they continue to exceed them because they want to move up, whether it's at your organization or another one. And that means that you need to keep the appetite going for these individuals. You need to continue to feed them the right fuel that's going to help them grow, help them move, try to move internally, because as one of my mentors says, internal promotions are the best thing on resumes. Or you need to understand that if you've done the best you can for them and you keep pushing up at that ceiling to move them, but the people up there aren't going to move or aren't going to help you, whatever it may be, unless you are at the top yourself and you can do that. Those superstars, you need to figure out a plan for them to continue moving forward outside of your organization if you can't do it internally. Because as we talked about earlier, those are your advocates. If you're feeding the right fuel to those high performers, those type A, they feel like you're supporting them, you're advocating for them, but you have these really great, frank communications with them where you're like, hey, we're going to do this, X, Y, Z, but I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think we're going to be able to move you up to this point. I'm going to keep you in the loop. We're going to figure it out. But if not, put me on your resume. Let me help you move up somewhere else. Those are your advocates, right? Those superstars are the advocates that had a great experience where you are. They outperformed everything, but they want to be middle managers. They want to be leaders. They want to be presidents. They want to be CEOs. They really want to move up, and you've got to take care of those superstars in a growth fashion versus rock stars where you want to keep them strong and make sure they're happy in a stable fashion.
How do you do it though? Like, what are the specific tactics that you would recommend? Somebody's listening in right now. How do you do it? What are the things that you need to put in place so that you find yourself not micromanaging and actually creating more of a growth leadership model?
Yeah, I would say for the rock star, the person who doesn't want to move, I would say have the conversation with them and say, okay, tell me the top 5 to 7 things that you love in your role right now that you don't want to change. And that is where you keep them happy, right? That's where that balance is. Because if you add more to their plate, too much, they don't want to do it. If you take away some of those things that keep them excited, that they're enjoying, well, then they may slow down a little bit. Then maybe they're not, hitting the expectations they are every time. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they're unstimulated, right? So I would say that for a rock star, I would say figure out what those things are and keep them in balance. And that means communicating. That means not adding more things to their plate unless they ask for it, right? Which usually rock stars won't ask for it unless it's another internal role that pays them more, they're still not leading, you know, and they could be leaders too. Rock stars could be leaders to a certain degree, but they don't want to, you know, add more to their plate. They're comfortable where they are, not stagnant. That's important to acknowledge. Rock stars aren't stagnant. Rock stars are people who are just happy at the status quo that they've set for themselves, that give them the type of life professionally and personally that they want, and they're just happy with it. So that's what I would say for rock stars. That's kind of keeping them in that middle balance, right? When you're when you're using a level, it's keeping the bubble right in the middle. And then I would say for superstars, I would say it's conversations about succession planning. I would say it's conversations about real growth charting. Like, here's where you are. Where do you want to go? Where do you see yourself in the next 1 or 2 roles, right? Because you don't want to go above that, because life can really change things. And that could be, you know, those next 2 roles could be in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years, right? But once you get past 3 years, life can really change. After 3 years, you don't know. So keeping it within a time range that you can kind of control a little bit more, that there may not be as many big changes. So working with them, understanding what they want, talking about succession planning, and finding development opportunities. And sometimes, depending on the role, and we can say in our work, in fundraising, that may not mean right up at the front giving them more money or this or that. It could be, hey, if I want to grow, I need to work with a principal gift donor. You know, can you talk to prospect management or strategy? If there's someone that we're pretty confident really has some wealth, can you assign them to me? Can I work on that? Maybe it's with you, right? You being the leader of them, saying, can we work on it together? Because that's gaining skills. Superstars want to gain skills because it helps them grow. That's part of, like you said, that's part of that growth plan. And I think another big one is, we talked about self-preservation, right? And empowerment. It's and not micromanaging, right? If you tell someone, I want you to do this, and I want you to make the decision, please do not go to them afterwards and say, oh, well, you didn't do this one little piece correctly. Because that's going to diminish everything else you've done, right? Let them do it. If it's not life or death, right? No one's normally dying in the work that we do, right? It's not life or death. If it's about personal preference versus effectiveness, you need to separate that. And I think that's also something where a lot of leaders really struggle. There's a difference between your personal preference and the effectiveness of what someone else is doing, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you have salutations or if you've signed a letter and your name isn't typed out, right? Like, it doesn't say, you know, Dr. Daniel Freeman, Chief Development Officer, and then I sign above it, right? If it's your preference to have your name and the signature, but, you know, you're working with someone, they're doing something and whatever it may be, and it doesn't have your name but your signature, that's personal preference. Is it still going to be just as effective? Yes. The people know where it's from. That's why I write little notes under things sometimes instead of just signing my name. I digress. But I think that has to be a really big thing with your superstars too. If you want them to grow, you have got to separate personal preference from effectiveness of the work that they're doing, because everyone has a different road to success, right? Some people are windy, some have a really big curve, some people are straight through. You just have to get to the point of success. And it doesn't always matter how you do it, but if you do it with the right principles and values, that's what matters. Because just like donors, they all go through different paths, just like we do, right? And it makes you a little bit more relatable and authentic.
That is such a great perspective. It really is. Because I even find myself just kind of reflecting as you were talking about, I've probably given directives that were definitely preference, not effective. Like, I do it this way. This makes me comfortable. This is how I want you to do it, rather than being willing to step out of the driver's seat in all situations and just trust them. Like, hey, this is best practice, but I want you to still get the job done in a sense.
Yes.
That is such a great perspective. One of the thoughts that I had, just in all that you're sharing, and this is literally the blueprint to what I believe how you lead well and lead at a high level, especially in these corporate spaces, educational spaces as well. But one of the things that I recognize is one of the perspectives that you always give is that you are your best advocate. But why I find that challenging to kind of just digest is in the nonprofit world and then in higher education, we're taught to be humble and servant leaders and to put the mission first and all of these different things. Can you talk to us about how do you balance that with advocating for yourself still? Like what does self-advocacy actually look like?
Yeah, I think, I had a conversation with someone yesterday and we were talking about this individual stepped into an interim role, and I had mentioned to them kind of the conversation that we were having was really related to this self-advocacy piece. And I think it really comes down to authenticity, right? Because you need to figure out how you're doing your work in the way that best fits you and how you best fit the organization, right? Because you're joining somewhere because you believe in the mission. You believe in the people you're working with. You love the population that you are impacting. You want to be part of that, right? And your connection to that is your authentic self. And that means that everything you do is going to connect to that mission, to those values, to the population that you're affecting, right? Or that you want to affect through that nonprofit or organization that you're working at. And I think that if you lead with that authenticity, then that is how people are going to perceive you. And that means that if they're perceiving you that way, the way you act, the way that you do things, people will always see that as genuine, and they'll see it connected to your personality, and they will see the authenticity that shines through that. And that's kind of a conversation I've been really thinking about lately is how do you advocate for yourself? What does that look like? How does that show up on a day-to-day scale? And the thing that I like to do is I like to compare that to playing the game, right? If you're pretending to be someone that you're not to benefit you in one way or another, you're doing that because you may feel insecure about yourself. You may feel insecure about how people view you, but that's not helpful for you because you can't live that double life forever, right? And when you act a certain way, and if your authentic self comes out one way or another, people are going to be like, who's that? This isn't authentic. This isn't who they are. Like, I don't believe that. People aren't going to trust that. They're not going to understand that. But if you always show up with your authentic self and people realize, okay, Dan has a super high motor, right? I remember when I left my first job at Charlotte, they had told Asheville, one of my colleagues told me, they were like, be careful because Dan's going to run. If you let him go, he's going to run. And because I have that high motor and I have all these ideas and these things that I want to do from kind of this internal qualitative research that I've done in all these other jobs, but that's who I am. And when you're getting me, I want you to know that, right? Like, and talking about authentic self and how to advocate for yourself, right? And how it starts with being your authentic self. I remember when I interviewed at Asheville, I think my last interview was with the athletic director, or maybe it was my first day, I forget. And we were talking about something and I got up and I can't remember if she went to shake my hand or whatever, but I gave her a hug. And we knew people, so it wasn't like she was some random person. But like I gave her a hug and I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Then she was like, no, like that was fine. Like for me, I love good hugs, right? I hate half arm hugs, right? Handshakes, totally fine. Bro hug, totally fine. Hate half hugs, right? It feels like a fake hug. But, I gave her a real hug. And to me, it was not intentional, but that showed my authentic self to her. And from then on, I think the reason that I loved working with her so much, and I still keep in touch with her, and we still talk. I sent someone up to Asheville to meet with her like a few weeks ago because she saw who I was authentically. And what that did is that when she saw me authentically, that meant I could be myself. And that meant that everything that I did was always me. So when it came towards the end of my time there, and it was during COVID time, she didn't want me to leave. And we had a conversation about that. And I was like, I feel like I'm called to something bigger. I want to go beyond athletics. I want to be closer to my family. But I did that without being scared. I wasn't afraid of what she was going to say. That was a big jump for me, for us. I mean, honestly, at that time, it was a new job. We were just getting married during the pandemic and we were moving. So things come in threes, right? But not once do I remember being scared of telling her that, because she knew who I was authentically. And because of that, there was no reason to be scared of advocating for myself. She knew I was a hard worker. She knew what I wanted to do because of my authentic self. That was always part of who I was in the conversations we had. It was all honesty. So that advocating part was never an issue. And it shouldn't be an issue. If people understand who you are and they accept you as your authentic self, everything you do is going to come through in every action that you make, which means that there should never be an issue with any kind of conversation speaking up for yourself.
I just found myself literally just lost in visualizing your words in practice. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for literally communicating in a way that's so practical, that's so tactical, and that's so simplistic, as from the stance of a leader wanting to make a difference, wanting to make a change in educational and nonprofit spaces. One last question. When you think of the book that you're working on, the journey that you're on, and the change that you wish to create, what do you hope changes for the next generation of leaders who continue to engage with your content, sit under your leadership, and potentially read your book once it comes out?
I want people to feel good. I want people to feel like they can be themselves. There's been so many times in my career where I've been afraid to be myself. And I think there's nothing scarier to other people than someone who isn't afraid to be themselves, right? Because everything that you do comes from your heart. If you are doing everything that fits in your values, that fits into who you are and in your personal vision, there's nothing scarier than that, because there's no bad motives behind it, right? Because it's just who you are, and it's consistent with who you are, even if it's consistently inconsistent, right? And I want people to understand that, especially in our work and in other fields, because we have conversations with people in other fields all the time, meet with them, right? And can totally relate to them. I had, and I'll say this real quick, I had a few meetings recently with really high level individuals and in banking and president of an institution. And they just talk to me. And, usually 20 minutes in, they'll be like, "Oh, I hope I'm not boring you. Like, I can totally stop talking." And I'll tell them, "No, like, this is what I want." Like that is special to me, because it makes me feel like people trust me, because they understand that I'm authentic about it, right? There's no ulterior motives. And I want people to understand it's the same thing in this work, and really all of our work. Not everything's relationship building, but in the things that need relationships, I want people to understand you can be your authentic self. You can be odd. You can be goofy. You can be confident. You can wear, whatever you want. You can wear a tie, even if no one else wears a tie, right? Even if people think it's stiff, if that's something you're working on, do it. Don't let other people talk about it, right? If you want to wear a blazer, wear a blazer, right? You don't have to wear perfect shoes. You can wear, nice sneakers, right? Whatever it may be. You can talk about your family, right? Some people are afraid to get too close with donors. And I just want people to understand that you have to be yourself. And there's nothing more powerful in our work than maybe not being comfortable with yourself, because that takes a lot of self-work, right? And a lot of self-love to do that. But being authentic and saying, it's okay to be who I am and let that shine, and don't let anyone dim your light, because there's nothing worse than second guessing yourself and letting that eat you away because you're worried about what other people are thinking or saying, and then that impacts you personally and professionally, and it dims your light. And anyone that works with me, works alongside me, works around me, the majority of them know, like, I want to celebrate you. We're going to have great conversation. Like, I want to help you. And I want people to feel that way. I want people to feel comfortable being their authentic selves, keeping their light bright, not dimming it, and continuing to try and try and try again. And that it's okay to fail.
Dan, I appreciate you, man. If I was to sum you up in a few words, it would be the light giver, because you've given so many people light. You've given so many people a platform. You've given me light, hope, belief, structure, and wisdom, and you lead with your heart. But then also you attach it with the strategy and the practical to be able to guide someone forward. And I appreciate you. All of the things that you talk about in this conversation, as well as in your book, that I've had the privilege of being able to have a first look at, is real, because I see it on a day-to-day basis. And I wanted to thank you for your leadership. Thank you for how you're showing up. If you're an audience member and you're wondering, when is this book coming out? He's working on it. You got to keep waiting a little bit more. You got to keep waiting. Dan, where can we find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at it's linkedin.com/Dan, the EDD man, or you can just look me up on there. I'm super active on social media. Some of the things that you're doing as well, which I'm grateful for that, to be a part of what you're doing. So you can find me there. And those are probably the two main easiest places to find me.
Perfect. If you had 10 seconds or one sentence to give to leaders that just needed to hear that last sentence, what would you say?
It's that if people can't accept you for your authentic self, that's their problem. It's not yours. And there's no reason to stop being who you are and who you want to be.
I'm your host, Kyle King. This is another episode of the Contagious Culture Podcast with Dr. Daniel Freeman, the EDD man on LinkedIn. One of the questions that I want you to remember is, what type of culture are you spreading? The energy you bring is the culture you create. Make yours worth catching. We'll see you all next episode.